In the shadowed halls of Harwood Hall, a scream shatters the night. Lady Beatrice Harwood is dead, poisoned in her own bed. Was it greed, betrayal, or a promise broken decades ago? Hercule Poirot, the master detective, steps into a web of lies where every guest hides a secret and every clue could be a trap. Who slipped cyanide into her glass? Why did she confront her killer alone? And what dark pact haunts this grand estate? Unravel the truth in this gripping tale of murder, motive, and Poirot's little grey cells before the killer strikes again. In the waning days of autumn, when the leaves of Sussex turned to a brittle gold and the air carried a sharp promise of winter, Harwood Hall stood as a monument to both grandeur and secrecy. Nestled in a secluded valley, its ivy-clad towers and mullioned windows loomed over the surrounding woods, a silent witness to the lives that unfolded within its walls. The estate, owned by the illustrious Harwood family for 3 centuries, was a place where time seemed to pause, where every polished banister and faded tapestry whispered of tradition and of things best left unspoken. It was on a particularly crisp October evening in 1928 that Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the loyal companion of Hercule Poirot, found himself invited to Harwood Hall. The invitation had come unexpectedly, penned in the elegant hand of Lady Beatrice Harwood herself, requesting his presence for a weekend gathering to celebrate the engagement of her son, Charles Harwood, to Miss Eleanor Vance. Hastings, always susceptible to the charm of high society, had accepted with enthusiasm, though he could not shake a vague sense of unease as the train carried him toward the estate. There was something in Lady Beatrice's letter, a certain stiffness, a formality that bordered on urgency, that suggested more than a mere social occasion. As the train rattled through the countryside, Hastings gazed out at the rolling hills, his thoughts drifting to his old friend, Hercule Poirot. The little Belgian detective, with his impeccable suits and fastidious habits, had been curiously absent from Hastings' life of late, immersed in what he called a small matter of intellectual curiosity in London. Hastings missed the sharpness of Poirot's mind, the way his friend could unravel the most tangled of human motives with a single, piercing glance. Little did he know that fate, as it so often did, would soon reunite them under circumstances far less pleasant than a weekend in the country. The car that met Hastings at the station was a sleek Rolls-Royce, driven by a taciturn chauffeur who offered no conversation beyond a curt nod. The drive to Harwood Hall was a winding one, through lanes shadowed by ancient oaks, their branches forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow the last of the daylight. When the hall finally came into view, its silhouette was stark against the twilight sky, the eyes of some great, watchful beast. Hastings was greeted at the door by a butler, a gaunt man named Perkins, whose demeanor suggested he had seen more of the Harwood family secrets than he cared to admit. "Captain Hastings, sir," Perkins intoned, his voice as dry as the rustling leaves outside. "Lady Beatrice awaits you in the drawing room." The drawing room was a study in opulence, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced Harwoods, their eyes following Hastings as he entered. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, and the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and old roses. The gathered company was small but distinguished, each member exuding a distinct air of unease beneath their polished manners. Lady Beatrice Harwood, a woman of 60 with silver hair and a commanding presence, rose to greet Hastings. Her smile was warm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety. "Captain Hastings, how delightful that you could join us," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with an edge that Hastings could not quite place. "You know my son, Charles, of course?" Charles Harwood, a tall, handsome man in his early 30s, stepped forward to shake Hastings' hand. His grip was firm, but his smile was strained, as though he carried a weight he could not share. Beside him stood Eleanor Vance, his fiancée, a striking young woman with auburn hair and a quiet intensity that seemed to draw every eye in the room. She offered Hastings a polite nod, her expression guarded. The other guests were equally intriguing. There was Dr. Malcolm Reed, a local physician with a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, a widowed cousin of Lady Beatrice, whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharper wit. And Mr. Gerald Langley, a solicitor and old friend of the family, whose genial manner seemed at odds with the calculating glint in his eyes. Rounding out the party was Miss Sylvia Crane, Eleanor's childhood friend, a pale, delicate woman whose frequent glances at Charles suggested feelings that went beyond mere friendship. Dinner was a formal affair, served in a dining room dominated by a massive chandelier and a table set with gleaming silver. The conversation was polite but strained, as though each guest were guarding a secret they feared might slip out with the next sip of wine. Hastings, ever the observer, noted the way Charles avoided Eleanor's gaze, the way Mrs. Winthrop's laughter rang a touch too shrill, and the way Dr. Reed's hands trembled slightly as he cut his pheasant. It was during the dessert course, as the butler poured coffee with a precision that rivaled Poirot's own, that the first hint of trouble emerged. Reed was at her side in an instant, his professional demeanor taking over as he checked her pulse. "It's likely nothing serious," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Perhaps a touch of indigestion. I'll fetch my bag." But Lady Beatrice waved him off, insisting she would retire to her room. "Please, continue without me," she said, her smile forced. "I shall be quite all right after a rest." The party dispersed soon after, the mood irrevocably altered. Hastings, unsettled by the evening's undercurrents, lingered in the drawing room, his thoughts turning to Poirot. How his friend would have relished this scene, with its veiled tensions and unspoken truths. Little did Hastings know that the events of the next few hours would make Poirot's presence not just desirable, but essential. As he made his way to his room, the hall's corridors seemed to close in around him, the portraits watching with silent judgment. He passed Eleanor Vance on the staircase, her face pale and her eyes wide with something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Captain Hastings," she said, her voice low, "do you ever feel as though a place can hold its own secrets, quite apart from the people within it?" Hastings, taken aback, managed to smile. "I suppose every old house has its ghosts, Miss Vance?" She nodded, but her expression suggested she spoke of something far more tangible than spectres. "Be careful," she murmured, before continuing down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. By the time Hastings reached his room, the unease that had been simmering all evening had coalesced into a knot in his stomach. He sat at the small writing desk, penning a quick note to Poirot, though he knew it was too late to post it that night. As he wrote, a faint sound reached his ears, a muffled cry, cut off abruptly, from somewhere deep within the house. Hastings froze, his pen hovering over the paper. The cry had been brief but unmistakable. He rose, his heart pounding, and stepped into the corridor. The hall was silent now, save for the distant creak of the house settling. He hesitated, wondering if he had imagined it, but the memory of Eleanor's warning lingered. It was then that he heard footsteps approaching, rapid, purposeful steps. Perkins, the butler, appeared around the corner, his face ashen.
"Captain Hastings," he said, his voice trembling. "You must come at once. It's Lady Beatrice. She's dead." Hastings felt a chill run through him. The weekend at Harwood Hall, which had promised nothing more than polite conversation and fine wine, had taken a dark and irrevocable turn. As he followed Perkins down the corridor, he knew one thing with certainty.
Against the polished oak floors. The cry Hastings had heard moments before lingered in his mind, sharp and fleeting, like a shard of glass glinting in the dark. Lady Beatrice Harwood, dead? It seemed impossible. Only hours ago, she had presided over dinner with the poise of a woman accustomed to command, a momentary indisposition dismissed as trifling. Yet Perkins's ashen face and trembling hands told a different story, one that Hastings, with his years of experience alongside Hercule Poirot, could only mean tragedy. They reached Lady Beatrice's bedroom on the second floor, a heavy oak door carved with intricate floral motifs standing slightly ajar. Perkins hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, as though reluctant to confront what lay beyond. "In here, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found her, just as she is." Hastings pushed past the butler, his heart thudding with a mix of dread and curiosity. The room was vast, its high ceiling adorned with plasterwork that gleamed faintly in the light of a single lamp. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its crimson drapes drawn back to reveal Lady Beatrice lying motionless, a silver hair fanned across the pillow. Her face, so animated at dinner, was now still, her lips parted slightly as though caught in mid-breath. Her right hand clutched the edge of a silk shawl, and the glass of water on the bedside table had tipped over, its contents darkening the wood. Hastings approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the scene. There was no blood, no obvious wound, yet the unnatural stillness of Lady Beatrice's form left no doubt. He leaned closer, noting the faint bluish tinge around her lips and the glassy stare in her eyes. Poison, he thought instinctively, though he lacked Poirot's expertise to confirm it. He turned to Perkins, who stood rigidly by the door. "When did you find her? And what made you check on her?" Perkins swallowed hard, his hands twisting together. "It was just past 11, sir. I was making my rounds when Miss Eleanor, stopped me in the hall. She said she'd heard a noise, a sort of gasp, from Lady Beatrice's room. She was agitated, sir. Insisted I check at once. I knocked, but there was no answer, so I entered. That's when I found her like this." Hastings frowned, recalling Eleanor's cryptic warning on the staircase. "And where is Miss Vance now?" "She went to fetch Dr. Reed, sir. They should be here any moment." As if on cue, perhaps half an hour, no more, the cyanosis around her mouth suggests... He hesitated, glancing at Hastings. "It suggests poison, though I'll need to examine her further to be certain." Eleanor let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Hastings, ever the gentleman, stepped forward to steady her, but she waved him off, her composure returning with visible effort. "Who could have done this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She was fine at dinner, wasn't she? Just a little unwell." Hastings nodded, his mind racing. "Dr. Reed, can you determine the type of poison?" "Not without a proper autopsy," Reed replied, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "But the symptoms, cyanosis, rapid onset, point to something like cyanide or strychnine, fast-acting, deadly in small doses. The word cyanide hung in the air like a storm cloud. Hastings glanced around the room, searching for anything out of place. The spilled water glass caught his eye again, its contents now a faint stain on the table. Beside it lay a small silver tray with a decanter of brandy and a single glass untouched. A book, its pages dog-eared, rested on the bedside table, and a delicate lace handkerchief lay crumpled near Lady Beatrice's hand. Everything seemed ordinary, yet Hastings knew from Poirot that the ordinary often hid the extraordinary. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of the other guests, drawn by the commotion. Charles Harwood burst in first, his face pale with shock. "Mother!" he cried, rushing to the bedside. His hands hovered over Lady Beatrice's still form, as though afraid to touch her. What happened? How could this happen? Mrs. Clara Winthrop followed, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with a calculating intensity. "Good heavens!" she murmured, her voice laced with something that might have been sorrow or perhaps satisfaction. Beatrice, of all people, she seemed indestructible. Gerald Langley, the solicitor, entered next, his genial demeanor replaced by a grim frown. "This is dreadful," he said, his gaze flickering to Charles. "We must call the police at once." Miss Sylvia Crane, the last to arrive, lingered in the doorway, a delicate frame trembling. "It's too horrible," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Charles rather than the body. "Who could do such a thing?" Hastings, observing the group, felt the familiar stirrings of a Poirot-like instinct. Each face, each reaction held a clue or a deception. He needed Poirot's clarity, his ability to see through the fog of human emotion. "We must secure the room," he said, his voice firm. "No one touches anything until the police arrive, and I shall send for Hercule." Carefully, that nothing should be assumed until all the facts are known. But Poirot will find those facts, I assure you. The police were summoned, and a local constable arrived within the hour, a burly man named Inspector Grayson, who seemed more accustomed to petty theft than murder. He took one look at Lady Beatrice's body and declared it a bad business, ordering everyone to remain in the drawing room while he secured the scene. Hastings, meanwhile, dispatched a telegram to Poirot, urging his friend to come with all haste. As the guests gathered in the drawing room, the atmosphere was one of stifled panic. Eleanor sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Charles paced like a caged animal. Mrs. Winthrop sipped brandy, her eyes darting from one person to another, as though weighing their guilt. Langley murmured legal platitudes and Sylvia Crane wept quietly, her handkerchief pressed to her face. Dr. Reed, still shaken, muttered about the need for a proper autopsy, while Perkins hovered in the background, his expression unreadable. Hastings, seated near the window, watched them all, his mind cataloguing details. The spilled water glass, Eleanor's insistence that Perkins check on Lady Beatrice, Charles's agitation, so different from his reserved demeanour at dinner, and that cry. Had it been Lady Beatrice's or someone else's? He longed for Poirot's presence, for the little Belgian's ability to sift through the chaos and find the thread of truth. It was nearly midnight when a car's headlights swept across the lawn, signalling Poirot's arrival. The door opened, and there he stood, immaculate in his patent leather shoes and neatly pressed suit, his moustache as pristine as ever. "Mon ami Hastings," he said, his green eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "You have, I see, stumbled into another affair most intriguing. Tell me everything." Hastings recounted the evening's events, from the strained dinner to the discovery of Lady Beatrice's body. Poirot listened, his head tilted slightly, his fingers steepled before him. When Hastings finished, Poirot nodded. "Bon, a puzzle, yes, but one that the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot shall unravel. First, I must see the body.
Then we shall speak with these suspects. As Poirot moved toward Lady Beatrice's room, Hastings felt a surge of relief. The master was here, and no secret, no matter how cleverly hidden, would escape his scrutiny. But as they climbed the stairs, Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that Harwood Hall held more than one crime, and that the truth, when revealed, would shake this house to its foundations. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Poirot. The great hall of Harwood Hall seemed to hold its breath as Hercule Poirot stepped inside, his small, precise figure a stark contrast to the looming grandeur of the estate. The flickering light of the chandelier caught the polish of his patent leather shoes and the meticulous curl of
his moustache, lending him an air of quiet authority. To Captain Hastings, who stood at his side, Poirot's arrival was like the first clear note in a symphony of chaos, a promise that order would soon be restored, no matter how tangled the threads of this tragedy. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice soft but commanding as he surveyed the drawing room where the guests were gathered. "You have painted a picture most vivid, but it is incomplete. The canvas of a crime such as this requires the brush of observation, the palette of psychology. Let us begin." Hastings, still shaken by the sight of Lady Beatrice's lifeless form, nodded eagerly. "Where do you want to start, Poirot? The body? The room? The guests?" Poirot's green eyes twinkled with a familiar gleam. "The body, naturellement. It is the silent witness, the one who cannot lie, though others may try to make it speak falsely. Lead on, Hastings." They ascended the grand staircase, the constable, Inspector Grayson, trailing behind, with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Grayson, a man of solid build and limited imagination, had already formed his own theory. Likely a heart attack, he'd muttered, though the bluish tinge around Lady Beatrice's lips had given him pause. "I've sent for the coroner," he said gruffly as they reached the bedroom door. "But I don't see much need for a detective from London. Looks like a medical matter to me." Poirot's smile was polite, but faintly pitying. "Ah, Inspector, the appearance of simplicity is often the greatest deception. Permit me, if you will, to observe with my own eyes." The bedroom was as Hastings had left it, save for the heavy silence that seemed to have settled over the scene. Lady Beatrice lay upon the bed, her face frozen in a mask of finality. Poirot approached with the reverence of a priest at an altar, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning every detail. He noted the spilled water glass, the untouched brandy decanter, the crumpled handkerchief, and the dog-eared book, a volume of poetry by Tennyson, its pages marked with a ribbon. "Curious," Poirot murmured, bending to examine the glass. He sniffed it delicately, his moustache twitching. "No odor of almonds which one might expect with cyanide, and yet the cyanosis, as Dr. Reed observed, suggests a poison of rapid effect. Hastings, you say the glass was spilled?" "Yes," Hastings replied. "It was like that when Perkins found her. Eleanor, Miss Vance, heard a gasp and sent Perkins to check." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A gasp, you say, and yet the poison, if it was poison, would have acted swiftly. A gasp implies struggle or surprise. We must consider the timing most carefully." He turned to the handkerchief, lifting it with a pair of tweezers.
Fuss over a handkerchief in a glass? The woman was ill at dinner, wasn't she? Could have been natural causes. Poirot's gaze flicked to the inspector, sharp as a blade. "Natural causes, mon ami, do not leave a woman of Lady Beatrice's vigour dead within hours, with no history of ailment save a moment of faintness. No, this is a crime, and one most cunning. But fear not, Hercule Poirot does not rely on chance. Every detail, every gesture will speak." Leaving the room, Poirot instructed Grayson to seal it until the coroner arrived, then led Hastings back to the drawing room. The guests were still there, their faces a gallery of suppressed emotions.
Charles Harwood stood by the fireplace, his jaw tight, his eyes red-rimmed. Eleanor Vance sat rigidly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant point. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, ever the observer, sipped her brandy with a faint smirk, as though the tragedy were a play she found mildly diverting. Gerald Langley paced near the window, muttering about legal ramifications, while Sylvia Crane dabbed at her eyes, her delicate frame trembling. Dr. Reed, perched on the edge of a chair, adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, his nervous energy palpable. Poirot stood in the centre of the room, his small stature somehow commanding every eye. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but resonant, "a great tragedy has befallen this house. Lady Beatrice Harwood, a woman of strength and dignity, is dead. The circumstances suggest not an act of nature, but of malice. I, Hercule Poirot, have been called to uncover the truth, and I assure you the truth will be found." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Charles stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "You're saying my mother was murdered? That's absurd. Who would want her dead?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "That, Monsieur Harwood, is precisely what I intend to discover. But first, I must ask each of you to recount your movements this evening, from the moment dinner ended until the discovery of Lady Beatrice's body. Let us establish the order of events, the alibis, if you will." The guests exchanged glances, some wary, others defiant. Eleanor spoke first, her voice steady despite her pallor. "After dinner, I went to the library to read. I was there until about 10:30, when I heard a sound, like a gasp, from the direction of Lady Beatrice's room. I found Perkins in the corridor and asked him to check on her." Poirot nodded, his eyes fixed on her. "And you were alone in the library, Mademoiselle Vance?" "Yes," she said, then hesitated. "That is, I believe so. It was quiet." Charles spoke next.
"I was there when Perkins raised the alarm." Mrs. Winthrop's laugh was sharp, cutting through the tension. "Well, I was in my room, brushing my hair and enjoying a moment of peace. These gatherings can be so tiresome. I heard nothing until the commotion began." Sylvia Crane's voice was barely audible. "I was in my room too. I couldn't sleep, so I was knitting. I didn't hear anything until Perkins knocked." Dr. Reed cleared his throat, his fingers twitching at his spectacles. "I was in the conservatory, looking at some of Lady Beatrice's orchids. She'd asked me to check on them earlier. I was there until I was called to her room." Poirot listened, his head tilted, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he clasped his hands behind his back. "Bon, a most interesting collection of alibis. And yet, someone in this house, or perhaps someone no longer present, has acted with deadly intent. I shall speak with each of you in turn tomorrow, when the mind is clear and the heart less guarded. For now, I suggest you retire, but do not leave the estate. The truth, mes amis, is like a shadow. It cannot hide forever." As the guests dispersed, Hastings caught Poirot's arm. "What do you make of it, Poirot? Everyone claims to have been alone, but someone must be lying." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Précisément, Hastings. The lie is there, in the spaces between their words, in the glances they avoid. But there is something else, a detail that does not fit. The gasp Mademoiselle Vance heard, the spilled glass, the handkerchief. These are not accidents. They are the fingerprints of a mind most calculated. Tomorrow, we shall begin to peel back the layers." As they retired to their rooms, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows of Harwood Hall. Hastings lay awake, his mind replaying the evening's events, while Poirot, in the room next door, sat at a small desk, his notebook open, his little grey cells already at work. The game, as Poirot would say, was afoot, and no one, not even the cleverest of criminals, could outwit Hercule Poirot for long. The questions begin. The morning after Lady Beatrice Harwood's death dawned cold and grey, the sky over Harwood Hall heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the oppressive mood within. Captain Hastings awoke early, his sleep troubled by the events of the previous night. The image of Lady Beatrice's lifeless form, the faint blue tinge around her lips, and the uneasy alibis of the guests haunted his thoughts. But with Hercule Poirot now on the scene, Hastings felt a flicker of hope that the tangled web of this tragedy would soon be unravelled. Poirot, as was his custom, was already awake and impeccably dressed when Hastings met him in the dining room. The little Belgian detective sat at the head of the table, sipping black coffee from a delicate porcelain cup,
with neat, precise handwriting. "Bon matin, Hastings," Poirot greeted, his green eyes sharp with purpose. "You have slept, I trust, though I suspect the dreams were not pleasant?" Hastings managed a wry smile as he took a seat. "Not exactly, Poirot. This place feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for you to uncover its secrets." "Précisément," Poirot said, tapping his notebook with a manicured finger. "And secrets it has, mon ami. Today, we begin the delicate task of peeling back the layers. Each person in this house has a story, and each story has a crack through which the truth may slip. We shall start with the interviews." The dining room, with its long mahogany table and somber portraits, was an imposing setting for Poirot's interrogations, but he seemed to draw strength from its formality. Inspector Grayson, who had returned with a junior constable to oversee the coroner's arrival, hovered in the background, his skepticism of Poirot's methods evident in his furrowed brow. The coroner had confirmed Dr. Reed's suspicion of poison, likely cyanide, though tests were still pending, and the room where Lady Beatrice died remained sealed, its contents untouched. Poirot began with Eleanor Vance, who entered the dining room with a composure that belied the strain in her eyes. She wore a simple grey dress, her auburn hair pinned neatly, but her hands betrayed her nerves, twisting a handkerchief as she sat across from Poirot. Hastings, seated to Poirot's right, noted the faint tremor in her fingers, a detail he knew Poirot would not miss. "Mademoiselle Vance," Poirot began, his voice smooth as velvet, "you have told us you were in the library when you heard the gasp that led to the discovery of Lady Beatrice's body. Tell me, if you please, exactly what you heard and why it alarmed you so." Eleanor's gaze flickered to the window, where rain had begun to patter against the panes. "It was just after 10:30, I think," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I was reading a novel, nothing important. The library was quiet, but then I heard a sound, like a sharp intake of breath, from the direction of Lady Beatrice's room. It was unnatural somehow. I can't explain it, but it frightened me. I went into the corridor and saw Perkins passing by, so I asked him to check." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "And this sound, mademoiselle? It was distinct? Not a creak of the house, not a gust of wind?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "It was human. I'm certain of it." "And yet," Poirot continued, "you were alone in the library, you say? No one else was present? No one passed by the door?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "Not that I saw, but the library is at the end of the corridor, and the light was dim. I suppose someone could have passed without my noticing." Poirot nodded, making a small note. "Relationship with Lady Beatrice. She approved of your engagement to her son, I presume." Eleanor's cheeks flushed slightly. "She was kind in her way. She wanted Charles to be happy, but I think she had reservations. She never said so outright, but I felt it." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Merci, mademoiselle. That will be all for now." Next came Charles Harwood, whose agitation had not subsided since the previous night. His handsome face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with grief,
and something else. Anger, perhaps, or fear. He sat heavily, his hands clenched on the table.
"I don't see what good this is,"
he said before Poirot could speak.
"My mother's dead, and you're asking questions as if we're all criminals."
Poirot's expression remained serene. "Monsieur Harwood, to find a criminal, one must ask questions of everyone, even those who grieve. Tell me, where were you between 10 and 11 last night, and what was your mother's state of mind at dinner?" Charles ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tight.
"I told you, I was in the billiard room with Langley until 10, then in my study. As for Mother, she seemed fine at dinner, just a bit tired. She mentioned feeling unwell, but it didn't seem serious. I thought she'd overexerted herself planning this weekend."
"And your relationship with her?" Poirot asked, his tone gentle but probing. "There were no disagreements?" Charles's eyes flashed.
"She was my mother. We had our differences like anyone, but nothing serious. She was the backbone of this family. I can't imagine why anyone would—"
His voice broke, and he looked away. Poirot made another note, his pen moving with deliberate precision. "Merci, monsieur. You may go." One by one, the others followed. Mrs. Clara Winthrop was sharp and dismissive, claiming she'd been in her room brushing her hair and had neither seen nor heard anything unusual. "Beatrice was a strong woman," she said, her lips curling slightly. "But strength makes enemies, doesn't it? People resent those who hold power." Gerald Langley, the solicitor, was more forthcoming, though his geniality seemed forced. "I was with Charles until 10, then in my room writing letters. Beatrice and I were old friends. She trusted me with the family's legal affairs. If there was trouble, she never mentioned it to me." Sylvia Crane, pale and trembling, could barely meet Poirot's gaze. "I was knitting in my room," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't hear anything until Perkins came. I can't believe this has happened. It's like a nightmare." Dr. Reed, the last to be questioned, was visibly nervous, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he spoke. "I was in the conservatory, as I said, checking the orchids. Lady Beatrice loved them."
Were meticulous, circling back to small details, the exact time each person left the dining room, the layout of the corridors, the sounds of the house. He asked about Lady Beatrice's habits, her relationships, her enemies. Each answer was met with a nod, a note, or a thoughtful tilt of his head. But Hastings could see the wheels turning in Poirot's mind, piecing together a puzzle only he could fully see. When the interviews concluded, Poirot closed his notebook and stood. "Mes amis," he said to the assembled group, "you have been most cooperative, and yet the truth remains elusive. But do not despair. Hercule Poirot does not rest until every shadow is illuminated. I shall examine the room again, and then we shall see what the little grey cells reveal." As the guests dispersed, Hastings leaned close. "What do you think, Poirot? They all seem to have alibis, but there's something off, isn't there?" Poirot's smile was faint but knowing. "Off, Hastings? Oh, oui. There's a rhythm to this house, a pattern of behavior, and someone has played a false note. The gasp, the spilled glass, the handkerchief, these are not mere details. They are the threads of a tapestry, and soon we shall see its design." As Poirot moved toward Lady Beatrice's room, Hastings followed, his heart heavy with the certainty that the truth, when it emerged, would be as shocking as it was inevitable. The rain continued to fall, cloaking Harwood Hall in a veil of secrecy, but Poirot's resolve was unshakable. The game, as he would say, was only just beginning. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The rain, that had begun as a gentle patter the previous night, had grown into a steady downpour by the time Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings returned to the drawing-room of Harwood Hall. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and the faint, lingering perfume of Lady Beatrice's roses, which sat in a vase on the mantelpiece, their petals drooping as if in mourning. The guests, confined by the weather and Inspector Grayson's orders, milled about with a restless energy, their polite facades fraying under the weight of suspicion. Poirot, however, remained as composed as ever, his sharp eyes missing nothing as he sipped his tisane, a small island of calm in the storm of unease. Hastings, seated beside him, could not shake the feeling that the case was slipping into deeper waters. The interviews had revealed little beyond vague alibis and guarded emotions, yet Poirot's serene confidence suggested he had already glimpsed something the others had missed. "What now, Poirot?" Hastings whispered, glancing at Charles Harwood, who stood by the window, staring out at the rain with a face like thunder. They all claimed to have been alone when Lady Beatrice died. Someone's lying, but who? Poirot's moustache.
Herring, the false trail that leads the hunter astray. But Hercule Poirot is not so easily misled. Observe, and we shall see who seeks to divert us. The morning had brought a new development. Inspector Grayson, with his blunt efficiency, had fixated on Dr. Malcolm Reed as the most likely suspect. The doctor's nervous demeanor, his access to medical supplies, and his presence in the conservatory, conveniently close to Lady Beatrice's room, had caught Grayson's attention. "It's obvious, isn't it?" Grayson said, his voice carrying across the room as he addressed Poirot and Hastings. "Reed's a doctor. He'd know how to get cyanide, how to administer it, and he was skulking about with those orchids, no one to vouch for him. I say we bring him in for questioning at the station." Poirot's expression was one of polite amusement, though his eyes were sharp. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur, you are most decisive, but haste is the enemy of truth. Dr. Reed's nerves, they are perhaps those of a man unaccustomed to violence, not necessarily a guilty one. Let us examine this obviousness more closely." Grayson huffed but relented, allowing Poirot to take the lead. Poirot requested that Dr. Reed join them in the library, a smaller, more intimate space lined with leather-bound books and a single window overlooking the sodden gardens. Reed entered, his spectacles slipping down his nose, his hands fidgeting with the cuffs of his jacket. "I don't know what more I can tell you, Mr. Poirot," he said, his voice high with strain. "I was in the conservatory, as I said. I had nothing to do with Lady Beatrice's death." Poirot's gaze was steady, almost hypnotic. "Monsieur le Docteur, let us speak plainly. You are a man of medicine, oui? You have access to substances, perhaps cyanide, perhaps others, that could end a life swiftly. Tell me, have you ever handled such a poison in your practice?" Reed's face paled, and he adjusted his spectacles with a trembling hand. "Well, yes, cyanide is used in small quantities in certain treatments, but it's tightly controlled. I haven't had any in my possession for years, not since my days in London. And I swear, I was only in the conservatory to check the orchids, as Lady Beatrice asked." Poirot nodded, making a small note in his ever-present notebook. "And these orchids, they were in good health? No signs of tampering? No unusual substances near them?" Reed blinked, clearly taken aback. "Tampering? No, they were fine. Lady Beatrice was particular about them, said they were her pride and joy. I checked their soil and leaves, nothing more." "Bon," Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. "And during your time in the conservatory, you heard nothing?" "You don't think he's guilty, do you?" Hastings asked once they were alone. "Grayson's convinced, but you seem skeptical." "Skeptical, Hastings? No, I'm merely cautious. Dr. Reed is nervous, oui, but nerves do not make a murderer. The cyanide, if it was cyanide, is too convenient a clue pointing to him. It is as if someone wishes us to look at the good doctor and no one else. A red herring, perhaps, placed with care. Their next stop was the conservatory itself, a glass-walled haven filled with exotic plants and the heavy scent of damp earth. Poirot moved among the orchids, his fingers brushing lightly over their delicate petals. He paused at a small workbench where gardening tools and a bottle of fertilizer sat, his eyes narrowing. "Regardez, Hastings," he said, pointing to a faint white powder on the edge of the bench. "This is not fertilizer. It is something else." Hastings peered at it, his heart quickening. "Cyanide?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, carefully collecting a sample with a handkerchief. "We shall have it tested, but note its placement, hidden yet not too hidden, another thread in our tapestry." Back in the drawing room, the other guests had grown restless, their alibis now the subject of whispered speculation among themselves. Charles Harwood, in particular, seemed agitated, his gaze darting to Eleanor Vance, who sat pale and silent by the fire. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, ever observant, remarked loudly, "If you ask me, it's always the quiet ones who have the most to hide. Isn't that right, Miss Vance?" Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "I've nothing to hide, Mrs. Winthrop. I loved Lady Beatrice. She was to be my mother-in-law." Clara's smile was sharp as a blade. "Love doesn't stop a crime, my dear. Sometimes it's the motive." Poirot, entering the room at the moment, caught the exchange and raised a hand for silence. "Mesdames et messieurs, let us not leap to accusations. The truth is not served by chaos. I have observed, I have questioned, and now I begin to see the shape of this crime. But I require one thing more, your patience. The killer is among us, and they are clever, but not cleverer than Hercule Poirot." His words, delivered with quiet conviction, sent a chill through the room. Sylvia Crane let out a small sob, while Gerald Langley cleared his throat nervously. Charles stepped forward, his voice low. "Mr. Poirot, if you know something, tell us. My mother deserves justice." "And she shall have it," Poirot replied, his eyes sweeping the room. "But justice requires precision. I ask you all to remain here, under Inspector Grayson's watch, while I continue my inquiries. The smallest detail may yet prove the key." As the day wore on, Poirot and Hastings retraced the events of the previous night.
Staircase that led to the second floor, and the fact that Eleanor's library was just down the corridor from the scene of the crime. Poirot paused at the staircase, his fingers tracing the worn banister. "This house," he said softly, "it is a labyrinth of secrets. But every labyrinth has a center, and we shall find it." By evening, Inspector Grayson had doubled down on his theory, insisting that Dr. Reed be detained. Poirot, however, urged caution, pointing out that the powder in the conservatory had yet to be analyzed. "If it is cyanide," he said, "it may point to Dr. Reed, or it may point away from him. We must wait for the truth to reveal itself." Hastings, watching the guests as they gathered for a tense dinner, felt the weight of suspicion settle over the table. Each glance, each word, seemed laden with hidden meaning. Clara's barbed comments, Charles' brooding silence, Eleanor's guarded glances, all were pieces of a puzzle that only Poirot could solve. And as the rain continued to fall, Hastings knew that the red herrings were multiplying, but Poirot's little grey cells were already cutting through the deception, inching closer to the heart of the crime. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The rain had not relented by the second morning at Harwood Hall, its ceaseless drumming against the windows a grim underscore to the tension that gripped the household. The air inside was heavy with suspicion, each guest moving as though under a spotlight, their every gesture scrutinized by the others. Captain Hastings,
bleary-eyed from another restless night, found himself marveling at Hercule Poirot's unshakable composure. The little Belgian detective sat in the library, his breakfast tray untouched save for a cup of steaming hot chocolate, his notebook open to a page filled with cryptic diagrams and annotations. To Hastings, it was as if Poirot were conducting an orchestra only he could hear. Each note a clue, each pause a revelation. "Poirot," Hastings ventured, leaning closer, "you've been awfully quiet since yesterday. That powder in the conservatory, do you think it's the key? Or is Grayson right about Dr. Reed?" Poirot's green eyes flicked up, a faint smile playing beneath his moustache. "Mon ami, the powder is but a single thread in our tapestry. It may be cyanide, it may be something else, but it is not the powder that occupies my thoughts this morning. It is a detail, small, overlooked, yet screaming for attention. Come, we shall revisit the scene of the crime." They made their way to Lady Beatrice's bedroom, now guarded by a young constable, who nodded stiffly as Poirot entered. The room was unchanged, its sombre elegance undisturbed, save for the coroner's brief examination. Lady Beatrice's body had been removed for autopsy, but the spilled water glass, the brandy decanter, the dog-eared with the precision of a watchmaker, his gloved hands hovering over each object without touching, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. "Regardez, Hastings," he said, pointing to the bedside table. "The glass, it is tipped over, yes, but observe its position. It lies on its side, yet the water has spilled in a direction most curious, away from the bed toward the edge of the table. If Lady Beatrice knocked it over in her final moments, as one might expect, the water would have spilled toward her." Hastings frowned, peering at the dark stain on the wood. "You're right, Poirot. That's odd. It's almost as if someone else knocked it over after she was already gone." "Précisément," Poirot said, his voice low. "And there is more. The handkerchief. See how it is crumpled, yet folded at one corner, as if it were held with care before being discarded. And this stain, lipstick perhaps, or something more sinister. We shall have it analyzed, but I suspect it holds a secret." He turned to the book, Tennyson's Poems, and opened it to the marked page. A ribbon bookmark rested at a poem titled "The Lady of Shalott," its lines underlined faintly in pencil. Poirot read aloud, his voice soft. "She left the web, she left the loom. She made 3 paces through the room." Curious, is it not, that Lady Beatrice chose this poem to mark? A woman trapped, cursed to see the world only through a mirror until she breaks free and meets her doom. Hastings shivered, the words striking a chord. "You think it's a clue? But who would leave it, and why?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "A clue, Hastings, is not always left intentionally. Sometimes it is a reflection of the mind, a gesture, a choice that betrays the heart. We shall see." Their inspection was interrupted by Inspector Grayson, who entered with a look of grim satisfaction. "We've got the results from the powder in the conservatory," he announced. "It's cyanide, all right. Found in a small vial tucked behind the fertilizer. Reed's our man, Mr. Poirot. No one else had the knowledge or the access." Poirot's expression remained serene. "And yet, Inspector, the vial is too convenient, no? Hidden yet not hidden well enough. A true murderer does not leave such evidence unless they wish it to be found. I suggest we speak with Dr. Reed again, and with Mademoiselle Vance, whose gasp set this tragedy in motion." They returned to the drawing room, where the guests were gathered, their faces a study in strained civility. Dr. Reed, summoned first, looked as though he hadn't slept, his spectacles fogging slightly as he sat before Poirot. "I've told you everything," he said, his voice cracking. "I was in the conservatory. I don't keep cyanide in my bag. It's not something a country doctor carries." Poirot's gaze was piercing. "And yet, Monsieur le Docteur, the cyanide was..." "See anyone else in the conservatory that evening? Anyone who might have placed the vial?" Reed hesitated, his fingers twitching. "No, I mean, I don't think so. It was dark and I was focused on the orchids, but I suppose someone could have come in earlier. The door was unlocked. Poirot made a note, his pen moving with deliberate care. Merci. You may go. Eleanor Vance was next, her composure fraying at the edges. She sat with her hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting an interruption. Mademoiselle, Poirot began, let us return to the gasp you heard. You are certain it came from Lady Beatrice's room? Not, perhaps, from the corridor or another room nearby? Eleanor's brow furrowed. I thought it came from her room. It was muffled, but it sounded close. I was so startled I didn't think to check the direction exactly. And your movements before this? Poirot pressed. You were in the library, alone, reading. Did you perhaps leave the library at any point? Eleanor's cheeks flushed. No, I stayed there. I told you I was reading until I heard the sound. Poirot nodded, but his eyes lingered on her, as if reading the spaces between her words. Bon. And your relationship with Lady Beatrice? There were no tensions, no disagreements over your engagement to Monsieur Charles? Eleanor's lips tightened. She was reserved, as I said. She wanted Charles to marry well, and I'm not... Well, my family isn't as grand as the Harwoods, but she never opposed us outright. As Eleanor left, Hastings leaned close. She's hiding something, Poirot. That hesitation, she knows more than she's saying. Oui, Hastings, Poirot replied, his voice soft. But what she hides is not necessarily guilt. It is fear, perhaps, or loyalty. We must tread carefully. The rest of the day was spent in observation, Poirot moving through the house like a shadow, his eyes catching details Hastings overlooked. A scuff mark on the servants' staircase, a faint perfume lingering in the corridor, a letter half burned in the drawing-room fireplace. Each detail, he assured Hastings, was a piece of the puzzle, though the picture remained elusive. By evening, the guests were fraying under the strain. Mrs. Clara Winthrop's barbed comments grew sharper. Charles's temper flared at the slightest provocation, and Sylvia Crane's tears seemed inexhaustible. Gerald Langley, ever the peacemaker, tried to calm the group, but his own unease was evident. Only Poirot remained unruffled, his mind working tirelessly behind his placid exterior. Hercule Poirot. Hastings stared at the notebook, the lines blurring before his eyes. But who, Poirot? Reed? Eleanor? Someone else? Poirot's smile was faint but certain. Patience, mon ami. The red herrings have distracted us, but the truth is emerging. Tomorrow, we shall tighten the net. As the rain continued to fall, Hastings felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The clue in the spilled glass, the stained handkerchief, the marked poem, they were no longer mere objects, but signposts to a truth that was both shocking and inevitable. And with Poirot leading the way, that truth could not remain hidden for long. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The third day at Harwood Hall dawned with a deceptive calm, the rain having softened to a fine mist that clung to the windows like a veil. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The guests, confined by the ongoing investigation and their own mounting suspicions, moved through the grand rooms with the wariness of chess pieces awaiting a fatal move. Captain Hastings, ever sensitive to the undercurrents of human emotion, felt the tension as a physical weight, a tightening in his chest that grew with each passing hour. Hercule Poirot, however, remained an island of precision, his demeanor
as polished as the silver candelabra that adorned the dining room table. Poirot had spent the early morning in Lady Beatrice's bedroom, re-examining the scene with a meticulousness that Hastings found both admirable and exhausting. The spilled water glass, the stained handkerchief, and the marked page of Tennyson's poetry had become talismans in Poirot's mind, each holding a fragment of the truth. But it was the half-burned letter in the drawing-room fireplace, discovered the previous evening, that now occupied his thoughts. "It is not enough to see the clues, Hastings," Poirot had said as they left the bedroom. "One must understand their purpose. The letter, it was meant to be destroyed, yet it survives. Why?" Hastings, following Poirot to the drawing-room, could only shake his head. "You think it's significant? It was barely legible, just a few words about debts and promises. Could be anything." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "No, mon ami. In a house such as this, nothing is just anything. The letter is a whisper from the past, and we shall make it speak." The drawing-room was quiet, the guests having retreated to their rooms or the library to avoid one another's company. Poirot knelt by the fireplace, retrieving the charred fragment with a pair of tongs. The paper was brittle, its edges blackened, but a few lines remained. Debts must be settled, promises broken, before it is too late. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably Lady Beatrice's, but the recipient's name—
"What?" Before Hastings could respond, the door opened, and Mrs. Clara Winthrop entered, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of Poirot with the letter. "Snooping through the ashes, Mr. Poirot?" she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "You'll find nothing but old gossip in this house." Poirot rose, his smile polite but piercing. "Madame Winthrop, gossip is often the shadow of truth. Perhaps you can enlighten me. Did Lady Beatrice have debts or promises that weighed heavily upon her?" Clara's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. "Beatrice? Debts? Hardly. She was the soul of prudence. As for promises, well, she was a Harwood. Her word was iron. But families like this always have their secrets, don't they? Promises broken, hearts bruised. You'd do better to ask Charles about that." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Monsieur Charles? And what promises might he have broken?" Clara shrugged, her smirk infuriatingly coy. "Oh, I'm sure he'll tell you it's nothing. But Beatrice was no fool. She saw the way the wind was blowing with that engagement. Her words hung in the air, a spark in the tinder of suspicion." Poirot thanked her and dismissed her with a nod, but Hastings could see the wheels turning in his friend's mind. "She's pointing us toward Charles," Hastings said as Clara left. "Do you think there's something to it? A rift between him and his mother?" "Perhaps," Poirot replied, his voice thoughtful. "But Madame Winthrop is a woman who enjoys stirring the pot, no? We must verify her hints with care." Their next encounter came unexpectedly, as they crossed paths with Gerald Langley in the corridor. The solicitor, usually genial, looked haggard, his eyes shadowed with worry. Poirot seized the opportunity, his tone deceptively casual. "Monsieur Langley, a word. As Lady Beatrice's solicitor, you would know of her financial affairs. Were there debts, perhaps, that caused her concern?" Langley's face tightened, his hands smoothing his jacket as if to steady himself. Beatrice's finances were impeccable. The Harwood estate is vast, land, investments, all in order. If there were debts, they weren't hers. I handled her affairs for years, and she never mentioned any trouble. "And promises?" Poirot pressed. "Did she speak of obligations, perhaps to family or friends?" Langley hesitated, his gaze flickering to the floor. She She did mention once, in passing, that she felt Charles was not living up to his responsibilities. Something about the estate and his engagement. But it was vague, Mr. Poirot. She wasn't one to confide. Poirot nodded, making a mental note. Merci, monsieur.
Hastings.
But we must not be swayed by the obvious. Let us speak with Monsieur Charles himself. They found Charles in the billiard room, his hands gripping a cue as though it were a lifeline. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, but there was a defiance in his posture that hadn't been there before. "What now, Mr. Poirot?" he asked, his voice sharp. "More questions? I've told you everything." Poirot's tone was gentle, almost fatherly. "Monsieur Harwood, I seek only the truth. Your mother, she was a woman of great strength. Yet she wrote of debts and broken promises. Were there matters between you, perhaps regarding your engagement to Mademoiselle Vance, that caused her distress?" Charles's grip on the cue tightened, his knuckles whitening. "My mother wanted me to marry well, yes. She thought Eleanor wasn't quite suitable. Not because of Eleanor herself, but because of her family. Modest means no title. We argued about it, but it wasn't serious. She'd come around, I'm sure of it." "And debts?" Poirot asked, his eyes never leaving Charles' face. Charles laughed bitterly. "Debts? The Harwoods don't have debts. If anything, Mother was the one holding the purse strings. She controlled everything, the estate, the investments. If there were debts, they were someone else's." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "And yet, someone in his house felt the weight of obligation. Tell me, did you see Mademoiselle Sylvia Crane that evening, after dinner?" Charles blinked, caught off guard. "Sylvia? No, I don't think so. She was in her room, wasn't she?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, his voice soft. "Merci, monsieur." As Charles left, Hastings turned to Poirot, his frustration mounting. "They're all pointing fingers. Clara at Charles, Langley at vague family tensions, Charles at no one in particular. And what's Sylvia got to do with it?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Sylvia Crane, Hastings, is a delicate thread in our tapestry. Her tears, her glances at Charles, they speak of a heart entangled. And where there is love, there is often betrayal. But come, let us speak with her." Sylvia was found in the conservatory, her delicate frame bent over a cluster of orchids, as if seeking solace in their beauty. Her eyes were red from crying, and she started at Poirot's approach. "Mademoiselle Crane," he began, his tone gentle, "you have been most quiet, yet I sense you know more than you say. Tell me, what was your relationship with Lady Beatrice?" Sylvia's voice was barely audible. "She was kind to me. She knew I cared for Charles, before Eleanor. She never judged me for it, but she warned me he was promised to another." "Promised?" Poirot's gaze softened, but his question was sharp. "And the night of her death, did you see or hear anything unusual?" Sylvia hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. I thought I heard footsteps in the corridor, near Lady Beatrice's room just before 10. But I was in my room, knitting. I didn't see who it was." As Sylvia fled the conservatory, tears brimming, Hastings shook his head. "Another lie, Poirot? Or is she just scared?" "Both, perhaps," Poirot replied, his voice low. "The lies are surfacing, Hastings, like ripples on a pond. Debts, promises, footsteps in the dark, they are the cracks in the facade. Tomorrow, we shall press harder, and the truth will begin to show itself." As the day drew to a close, the mist outside thickened, cloaking Harwood Hall in secrecy. But Poirot's little grey cells were at work, weaving the threads of deceit into a pattern only he could see. The lies were mounting, but the truth was closer than ever. The fourth day at Harwood Hall broke under a sky that had finally cleared, the sun casting pale, tentative rays through the tall windows as though reluctant to illuminate the secrets within. The atmosphere among the guests had grown brittle, like glass stretched to the point of shattering. Captain Hastings, ever attuned to the human heart, sensed that the strain of suspicion, coupled with Poirot's relentless probing, was pushing someone or something to the breaking point. Hercule Poirot, however, remained as composed as ever, his small figure radiating an unshakable certainty as he sipped his morning tisane in the library, his notebook now a labyrinth of notes and diagrams. "Hastings," Poirot said, his voice low and deliberate. "Today is a day for the heart, not merely the mind. The lies we have uncovered, debts, promises, footsteps in the dark, they are but the surface. Beneath lies the motive, the passion that drives a soul to murder. We must provoke, mon ami, and see who cracks." Hastings frowned, his coffee growing cold in his hand. "Provoke? You mean push them until someone confesses?" "That sounds risky, Poirot. These people are already on edge." Poirot's eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity. "Précisément, Hastings. It is when the mind is on edge that the truth slips through. We shall gather them this afternoon, and I shall apply the pressure, gently but firmly. But first, we must confirm a suspicion." Their morning began with a return to the conservatory, where the faint trace of cyanide had been found. Poirot, with his characteristic precision, examined the workbench once more, his gloved fingers tracing the edge where the vial had been tucked. "This cyanide," he murmured. "It is too convenient, too neatly placed. It points to Dr. Reed, yet on the workbench, barely visible in the morning light." "This mark," Poirot said. "It is fresh, made by something sharp, perhaps a ring, perhaps a tool. Someone was careless, and carelessness is the enemy of the perfect crime." Hastings peered at the scratch, his mind racing. "You think it was made the night of the murder? By whoever planted the cyanide?" "Perhaps," Poirot replied, his tone enigmatic. "Or perhaps it is a sign of haste, of panic. We shall see." Their inspection was interrupted by the arrival of Perkins, the butler, whose gaunt face was even paler than usual. "Mr. Poirot," he said, his voice trembling, "Miss Crane is in a state. She's in the drawing-room, crying something awful. I thought you should know." Poirot's eyebrow arched. "Mademoiselle Crane? Bon. This is the moment we have been waiting for. Come, Hastings." They found Sylvia Crane collapsed in an armchair by the drawing-room fire, her delicate frame shaking with sobs. Her knitting lay abandoned on the floor, a tangle of wool and needles, and her face was streaked with tears. The other guests hovered nearby, their expressions a mix of concern and suspicion. Charles Harwood stood closest, his hand hovering as if unsure whether to comfort her. Eleanor Vance watched from a distance, her face pale and unreadable, while Mrs. Clara Winthrop's sharp eyes glinted with interest. Gerald Langley and Dr. Reed lingered near the door, both looking uncomfortable. "Mademoiselle Crane," Poirot said, his voice gentle but commanding, "you are distressed. Tell me, what has caused such tears?" Sylvia looked up, her eyes red and pleading. "I can't bear it any more," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All this suspicion, all these questions. I know something, Mr. Poirot, and it's eating me alive. I didn't want to say, but I can't keep silent any longer.
The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Sylvia. Hastings felt his pulse quicken, sensing that this was the turning point Poirot had anticipated. "Speak, mademoiselle," Poirot urged, his tone soothing yet insistent. "The truth, it is a burden that must be shared." Sylvia's hands twisted together, her voice barely audible. "That night, I lied about being in my room the whole time. I did hear footsteps, but I also saw someone. I was in the corridor, near Lady Beatrice's room, just before 10. I'd gone to fetch a book from the library."
Voice sharp.
"Sylvia, how could you? Charles wouldn't hurt his mother. You're mistaken, or you're lying."
Poirot raised a hand, his authority silencing the room. "Mademoiselle Crane, this is a grave accusation. You are certain of what you saw? The light in the corridor? It was dim, no? Could it have been another man, perhaps?" Sylvia hesitated, her certainty wavering. "It was dark, yes, but I thought it was Charles. The way he moved, his height, I'm almost sure." "Almost," Poirot repeated, his tone soft but pointed. "Merci, mademoiselle. Your honesty is noted. Monsieur Harwood, have you anything to add?" Charles' jaw tightened, his voice low with fury. "She's wrong. I wasn't near Mother's room. Sylvia, why would you say this? You know I loved her." Sylvia's sobs intensified, and she buried her face in her hands. Poirot watched her closely, his expression unreadable, then turned to the others. "Mesdames et messieurs, this revelation, it changes the rhythm of our puzzle. But let us not rush to judgment. The truth is like a delicate flower. It must be handled with care." As Sylvia was led away by Eleanor, who seemed torn between anger and pity, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" Hastings whispered, "Is Sylvia telling the truth, or is she deflecting suspicion?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Mademoiselle Crane is a woman in love, Hastings, and love can cloud the eyes as much as it sharpens them. Her tears are genuine, but her story, it is not complete. She has given us a piece of the truth, but it is wrapped in emotion. We must now test this piece against the others." The rest of the day was spent in quiet observation, Poirot moving among the guests like a shadow, his questions subtle but relentless. He spoke again with Perkins, who confirmed that the corridor near Lady Beatrice's room was dimly lit, with shadows that could easily distort a figure's identity. He questioned Langley about Charles' movements in the billiard room, noting a slight discrepancy in their timelines. Langley claimed they parted at 10, while Charles insisted it was closer to 9:45. Small but significant, Poirot noted. By evening, the tension in Harwood Hall was palpable. Charles avoided Sylvia, his anger barely contained, while Eleanor seemed caught between loyalty to her fiancé and doubt sown by Sylvia's words. Mrs. Clara Winthrop watched it all with a smirk, as if enjoying the unravelling of the household. Dr. Reed, still under Grayson's suspicion, grew increasingly withdrawn, his nervous tics more pronounced. As night fell,
"And the killer will reveal themselves." Hastings stared at him, his heart pounding. "A trap? What kind, Poirot?" Poirot's smile was faint but certain. "A trap of the mind, mon ami. We shall gather them all, and with the right pressure, the guilty will betray themselves. The little grey cells, they are ready." As the fire crackled in the library, casting long shadows across the room, Hastings felt the weight of the moment. Sylvia's confession had opened a door, but what lay beyond was still shrouded in mystery.
With Poirot's trap in place, the truth was closer than ever. But so too was the danger. Chapter 9. The Trap. The fifth day at Harwood Hall carried an air of inevitability, as though the house itself knew that the secrets it held could no longer be contained. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished floors, but the light did little to dispel the gloom that clung to the guests. Sylvia Crane's tearful revelation the previous day had fractured the fragile civility of the group, and now suspicion hung over them like a storm cloud, ready to break. Captain Hastings, ever sensitive to the shifting moods, felt the tension as a knot in his chest, but Hercule Poirot's calm was unshaken, his eyes alight with the quiet certainty of a man who knew the endgame was near. In the library, where Poirot had taken to conducting his most private deliberations, he sat with his notebook open, its pages now a dense web of notes, timelines, and cryptic sketches. Hastings, pacing near the fireplace, could not contain his impatience. "Poirot, Sylvia's story about seeing Charles, it's thrown everyone into chaos. Do you believe her? And what's this trap you mentioned? You're not going to let Grayson arrest Charles, are you?" Poirot's moustache twitched as he set down his pen. "Mon ami, you are like the hare, always racing ahead. The trap is not for Monsieur Charles, nor for any one person, yet. It is for the mind of the guilty, to coax them into a misstep. Sylvia's confession, it is a piece of the truth, but it is like a mirror held at an angle. It distorts as much as it reveals. Today, we shall gather all the players, and with a little pressure, the true picture will emerge." Hastings frowned, his mind replaying Sylvia's tearful accusation. But if Charles wasn't in his mother's room, who was? And why would Sylvia lie or be mistaken? Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "That, Hastings, is the heart of our puzzle. The figure in the corridor, the gasp, the spilled glass, they are not accidents. They are the choreography of a crime, and we shall now call the dancers to the stage." Poirot's plan was to gather the guests in the drawing-room that afternoon, under the pretext
Impression, mes amis, Poirot explained to Hastings and Grayson, that the net is tightening. The guilty one will feel the pressure, and in their fear, they will betray themselves. By 2 o'clock, the drawing-room was filled with a tense assembly. Charles Harwood stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of barely contained anger, his eyes avoiding Sylvia Crane, who sat pale and trembling in a corner, her hands clutching a handkerchief. Eleanor Vance sat beside her, her expression a mix of concern and wariness, as though unsure whether to comfort or confront her friend. Mrs. Clara Winthrop reclined in an armchair, her sharp gaze darting from one person to another, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Gerald Langley stood near the window, his geniality replaced by a nervous fidgeting, while Dr. Malcolm Reed, still under Grayson's suspicion, adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, his face pale. Perkins, the butler, hovered near the door, his gaunt figure almost invisible in his silent efficiency. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his small stature commanding every eye. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice clear and resonant. "We are gathered to discuss the tragic death of Lady Beatrice Harwood, a woman of strength and dignity, taken from us by an act most foul. I have observed, I have questioned, and now I am close to the truth. But before I reveal it, I must ask you to consider the events of that night once more." He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "We know that Lady Beatrice died of poison, cyanide to be precise, administered in a manner most subtle. We know that Mademoiselle Vance heard a gasp, that Mademoiselle Crane saw a figure in the corridor, that a glass was spilled, a handkerchief stained, a letter burned. These are not mere details, they are the threads of a tapestry, and one among you has woven it with care.
A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by Poirot's raised hand. "Let us consider the alibis," he continued. "Monsieur Charles, you were in the billiard room with Monsieur Langley until 10, then in your study. Mademoiselle Vance, you were in the library, alone, until you heard the gasp. Mademoiselle Crane, you were knitting in your room, until you ventured into the corridor. Madame Winthrop, you were brushing your hair. Monsieur Langley writing letters. Monsieur Reed tending to orchids. And yet, someone was in Lady Beatrice's room, someone who left a glass spilled in a manner most unnatural." Charles stepped forward, his voice tight. "Mr. Poirot, I wasn't in my mother's room. Sylvia's mistaken or lying. I don't know why she'd say such a thing, but I swear it wasn't me." Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Eleanor reached for her hand, then hesitated, her own expression troubled. Clara Winthrop laughed sharply. "Oh, come now, Charles. We all know families have
your little romance, and you lost your temper." Charles's face reddened, but before he could retort, Poirot intervened. "Madame Winthrop, accusations are not evidence. Let us consider another detail. The letter, half burned in this very fireplace. It spoke of debts and broken promises. Monsieur Langley, as Lady Beatrice's solicitor, can you confirm her financial state?" Langley cleared his throat, his hands smoothing his jacket. "As I've said, her affairs were in order. No debts, only wealth. If there were promises broken, they weren't financial." Poirot nodded, his gaze shifting to Dr. Reed. "And you, Monsieur le Docteur, the cyanide found in the conservatory, placed so conveniently where you worked, yet you insist you had no access to such a poison. Tell me, did you see anyone else near the conservatory that evening?" Reed's spectacles slipped, his voice trembling. "No, I was alone. But I swear, I didn't bring cyanide. Someone must have planted it." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he turned to the group. Someone indeed. The cyanide, the figure in the corridor, the spilled glass, these are the tools of a mind that seeks to mislead. But Hercule Poirot is not misled. I propose a small experiment. Tonight, after dinner, we shall recreate the events of that fatal evening. Each of you will take your place as you were between 9 and 11. We shall see what the shadows reveal. A stunned silence followed. Eleanor's voice broke it, soft but firm. "Mr. Poirot, what are you hoping to find? Do you think one of us will confess?" Poirot's smile was faint but chilling. "I hope, mademoiselle, to see the truth reflected in your actions. The guilty cannot hide forever, not from the little grey cells." The guests dispersed, their unease palpable. Hastings, following Poirot to the library, felt his heart race. "A reenactment? Poirot, that's bold. Do you really think the killer will slip up?" "Oui, Hastings," Poirot replied, his voice low. "The killer is clever, but they are human. Under pressure, they will falter. A glance, a hesitation, a gesture. The trap is set, and tonight we shall see who steps into it." As evening approached, the house buzzed with nervous anticipation. The guests moved through dinner in near silence, their eyes darting to Poirot, who ate with his usual fastidiousness, as though unaware of the storm he was about to unleash. Hastings, watching them all, felt the weight of the moment. The trap was a gamble, but with Poirot at the helm, it was a gamble backed by genius. The truth, he knew, was closer than ever, but so was the danger, lurking in the shadows of Harwood Hall. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The evening at Harwood Hall carried a weight of expectation.
Barely touching their food, their eyes flickering between one another and the small, immaculate figure of the Belgian detective. Captain Hastings, seated beside Poirot, felt his pulse quicken with each passing minute, sensing that the trap Poirot had set was about to spring. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and the flickering candlelight only deepened the shadows in which the truth hid. Poirot, as was his custom,
remained serene, his movements precise as he sipped his wine and observed the gathering with his piercing green eyes. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said at last, rising from his chair as the dessert plates were cleared. "The hour has come. Tonight we shall recreate the events of the night Lady Beatrice Harwood met her end. Each of you will take your place as you claimed to be between 9 and 11 that evening. I, Hercule Poirot, shall observe, and the truth, it will reveal itself." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Charles Harwood, his face pale and drawn, clenched his fists. "This is absurd, Poirot. What do you expect to find? I've told you I wasn't near my mother's room." Poirot's smile was calm but unyielding. "Monsieur Harwood, the truth is like a melody. It cannot be hidden when the orchestra plays. Let us proceed." The guests, under Inspector Grayson's watchful eye, dispersed to their respective locations. Charles and Gerald Langley positioned themselves in the billiard room, their movements stiff and reluctant. Eleanor Vance took her place in the library, a book in hand, her face a mask of tension. Sylvia Crane retreated to her room, clutching her knitting needles as though they were a lifeline. Mrs. Clara Winthrop claimed her spot in her bedroom, brushing her hair with exaggerated nonchalance, while Dr. Malcolm Reed returned to the conservatory, his nervous tics more pronounced than ever. Perkins, the butler, was instructed to retrace his rounds, pausing near Lady Beatrice's room as he had when Eleanor summoned him. Poirot and Hastings moved through the house, their footsteps soft on the polished floors, observing each guest from the shadows. The corridors were dimly lit, the flickering lamps casting long, distorted shapes that seemed to dance with secrets. Poirot's eyes were everywhere, noting the way Charles gripped the billiard cue too tightly, the way Eleanor's book trembled in her hands, the way Sylvia's needles clicked with an erratic rhythm. In the conservatory, Dr. Reed fumbled with a watering can, his spectacles slipping as he glanced nervously toward the door. At precisely 10:30, Poirot signaled for Eleanor to reenact her discovery of the gasp. She stepped into the corridor, her face pale, and called to Perkins, who appeared as instructed. "I heard it from there," she said, pointing toward Lady Beatrice's room, her voice shaking. "It was faint, but it was there." Poirot nodded, his gaze fixed on the corridor. "And the figure, mademoiselle, where did you see it?" Sylvia, summoned from her room, hesitated, her eyes darting to Charles. "It was there, near the door. I thought it was Charles, but the light was so dim." Poirot's voice was sharp. "Show us, mademoiselle. Walk as you did that night." Sylvia obeyed, her steps faltering as she approached the door to Lady Beatrice's room. The group gathered behind her, their breaths held, as Poirot watched with the intensity of a hawk. Suddenly, he raised a hand. "Arrêtez! Stop! Look there, in the shadow by the staircase." All eyes turned to the narrow servants' staircase, where a faint glint of metal caught the light, a small, silver cigarette case, half hidden in the gloom. Poirot retrieved it with a handkerchief, holding it up for inspection. "This," he said, "does not belong here, and it tells a story most revealing." Charles' face darkened. "That's mine," he said, his voice low. "But I didn't drop it there. I haven't used it in days." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps, monsieur, but let us return to the drawing room. The time for games is over." The guests, now thoroughly unsettled, followed Poirot back to the drawing room, where he stood before the fireplace, the cigarette case in his hand. Inspector Grayson, his patience wearing thin, crossed his arms. "Well, Mr. Poirot, what's this all about? Are you saying Harwood's the killer?" Poirot's smile was faint, but triumphant. "No, Inspector. The killer is not Monsieur Charles, though the killer wished us to believe so. Let me explain, step by step, the truth of Lady Beatrice's murder." He paced slowly, his voice clear and commanding. "The crime was one of precision, planned with care. Lady Beatrice died of cyanide, administered in her water glass, which was then deliberately spilled to suggest a struggle. But the spill was wrong.
It flowed away from the bed, not toward it, as it would if she had knocked it over in her final moments. This was the first clue that the scene was staged. He held up the handkerchief. The stained handkerchief, marked with lipstick, or so it seemed. But the stain was not lipstick. It was a trace of cyanide, applied to mislead us. Someone wished us to think Lady Beatrice had touched the poison herself, perhaps by accident. The guests shifted uneasily, their eyes locked on Poirot. He continued. The half-burned letter spoke of debts and broken promises, suggesting a motive tied to the family. And then Mademoiselle Crane's tearful confession. She saw a figure, thought to be Charles, leaving Lady Beatrice's room. But the figure was not Charles. It was someone else, someone who used the dim light and Sylvia's love for Charles to cast suspicion upon him. Charles' voice was hoarse. Who then? Who did this? Poirot turned to the group, his gaze settling on Gerald.
The cigarette case found by the servant's staircase is indeed Monsieur Charles, but it was you who placed it there. You who slipped into Lady Beatrice's room that night, using the staircase to avoid detection. You who poisoned her water, knowing she would drink it before retiring. Langley's face went white, his genial mask slipping. That's preposterous! I was in my room writing letters. You have no proof. Poirot's voice was calm but relentless. The proof, monsieur, is in the details. The scratch on the conservatory workbench, made by your signet ring as you hid the cyanide vial, hoping to implicate Dr. Reed. The burned letter written by Lady Beatrice was addressed to you, warning you to settle your debts. Debts you owed not in money, but in loyalty. She had discovered your secret, had she not? That you had been siphoning funds from the Harwood estate, using your position as solicitor to cover your own financial ruin? A gasp escaped Eleanor, and Charles took a step toward Langley, his fists clenched. Is this true, Gerald? You betrayed my mother? Langley's composure cracked, his voice rising. I didn't mean for it to come to this. She was going to expose me, ruin me. I had no choice. Poirot nodded, his expression grave. You had a choice, monsieur. You chose murder. You slipped into her room, poisoned her water, and staged the scene. You dropped Charles' cigarette case to cast suspicion, knowing Sylvia's feelings for him might lead her to misidentify a figure in the dark. But you underestimated Hercule Poirot. Inspector Grayson stepped forward, his handcuffs at the ready. That's enough, Langley. You're coming with me. As Langley was led away, his protests fading, the room fell silent. Sylvia sobbed quietly, Eleanor's hand on her shoulder, while Charles stared into the fire, his grief now mingled with relief. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, for once, had no sharp remark, her face pale with shock. Hastings, stunned by the revelation, turned to Poirot. How did you know, Poirot? The cigarette case. The scratch. It was all so subtle. Poirot's smile was faint. The little grey cells, Hastings. They see what others overlook. The truth was there. In the inconsistencies, the gestures, the motives. Langley's geniality was his mask, but the mask could not hide forever. As the guests dispersed, the weight of the truth settling over them, Poirot stood by the window, gazing out at the now clear sky. The trap had sprung, the killer revealed, and Harwood Hall was free of its darkest shadow, at least for now. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning after Gerald Langley's dramatic unmasking as Lady Beatrice Harwood's murderer, Harwood Hall seemed to exhale, as if the very walls had been holding tapestries. Yet the warmth could not fully dispel the chill of grief and betrayal that lingered among the guests. Captain Hastings, standing in the drawing-room, felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy. The truth had been revealed, the killer apprehended,
but the cost of that truth weighed heavily on the household. Hercule Poirot, ever the picture of composure, sat by the fireplace, his small hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. His notebook, now closed, rested on the table beside him, its pages a testament to the meticulous workings of his little grey cells. Hastings, unable to remain still, approached his friend, his voice low. "Poirot, you've done it again." Langley's confession. It was extraordinary. But how did you know it was him? The cigarette case, the scratch, how did you piece it all together? Poirot's smile was faint, almost wistful. "Mon ami, the truth is not found in grand gestures, but in the small, the overlooked. The cigarette case. It was a clue too perfect, placed to point to Monsieur Charles. The scratch in the conservatory, made by a ring, Monsieur Langley's signet ring, which I observed on his hand during our first meeting. And the letter, half burned, with its talk of debts and promises. It was not a financial debt, as I first suspected, but a debt of trust. Lady Beatrice had discovered Langley's embezzlement, and he could not allow her to expose him." Hastings shook his head, marveling. "But Sylvia's story about seeing Charles, how did you know she was mistaken?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. Mademoiselle Crane saw what her heart wished to see, or feared to see. Her love for Charles clouded her perception, and Langley, knowing this, used it to his advantage. The dim light, the hurried figure, it was enough to plant doubt. But the little grey cells, they do not doubt. They observe, they reason, they conclude. The guests, though still shaken, began to gather in the drawing-room, drawn by the need for closure. Charles Harwood, his face etched with grief but softened by relief, approached Poirot. "Mr. Poirot, I don't know how to thank you. My mother's death, it's a wound that won't heal. But knowing the truth, knowing it wasn't one of us, it helps." Poirot inclined his head. "Monsieur Harwood, the truth is a balm, but it is also a mirror. It shows us who we are, and sometimes that reflection is painful. Your mother was a woman of strength, and her memory will endure." Eleanor Vance, standing beside Charles,
eyes still red from tears.
"I'm so sorry, Mr. Poirot. I thought I saw Charles, and I let my feelings cloud my judgment. I nearly ruined everything." Poirot's voice was gentle. "Mademoiselle Crane, the heart is a powerful lens, but it distorts as often as it clarifies. You spoke your truth, and that truth helped us find the real culprit. Be at peace." Mrs. Clara Winthrop, for once subdued, offered a curt nod. "Well, Mr. Poirot, I'd admit I didn't think you'd manage it, but you've proved me wrong. Beatrice would have approved of your theatrics." Poirot's moustache twitched with amusement. "Madame, the theatrics, as you call them, are but the stage for the truth. Hercule Poirot does not perform, he reveals."
Dr. Malcolm Reed, no longer under suspicion, adjusted his spectacles with a shaky hand.
"I thought I was done for, Mr. Poirot. That cyanide in the conservatory, I knew it wasn't mine, but I couldn't prove it. Thank you."
Poirot nodded.
"Monsieur le Docteur, the innocent need not fear when the truth is sought. The cyanide was a red herring, placed to mislead, but it could not deceive the little grey cells."
Inspector Grayson, standing by the door, cleared his throat.
I'll be honest, Mr. Poirot. I thought you were wasting your time with all your questions and reenactments. But you've got a knack for this. Langley's being taken to the station, and the coroner's report confirms cyanide in the water glass. It's a solid case. Poirot's smile was modest. Merci, Inspector. The case is solid because the truth is solid. It is the foundation upon which justice rests. As the guests began to disperse, preparing to leave Harwood Hall and return to their lives, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "Come, mon ami. Let us walk in the garden. The air is fresh, and the mind, it craves clarity after such a storm." They stepped outside, the gravel crunching underfoot as they wandered among the rose beds, now glistening with the remnants of the morning's mist. The gardens, so carefully tended by Lady Beatrice, seemed to breathe easier in the sunlight, their beauty a quiet tribute to her memory. Hastings, still processing the events, broke the silence. "Poirot, what you did in there, it was like watching a maestro conduct a symphony. But what now? The case is solved? Langley's caught? What's left?" Poirot paused by a rosebush, his fingers brushing a petal with reverence. "What is left, Hastings, is the reflection. Each case, it teaches us something of the human heart. Lady, her broken heart." "Oui," Poirot said softly. "But they will heal, as all wounds do, with time. And we, Hastings, we move on to the next puzzle, the next challenge for the little grey cells. For as long as there is human nature, there will be mysteries to solve." They walked in silence for a moment, the sun warming their faces. Poirot's expression was serene, but there was a hint of melancholy in his eyes, as though he felt the weight of the truths he uncovered. "You know, Hastings," he said at last, "the life of Hercule Poirot is not an easy one. To see the darkness in the heart, to bring it to light, it is a burden. But it is also a privilege, to restore order where chaos reigns." Hastings clapped a hand on his friend's shoulder, a rare gesture of familiarity. "You're one of a kind, Poirot. I don't know how you do it, but I'm glad you're here." Poirot's smile returned, brighter this time. "And I, mon ami, I'm glad for your company. Now, let us return to London. Harwood Hall has no more secrets to yield, and the city, it calls to us with new adventures." As they made their way back to the house to gather their things, the roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals catching the light. Harwood Hall, for all its tragedy, stood a little lighter, its shadows dispelled by the relentless pursuit of truth. And Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells and his unyielding sense of justice, walked away, ready for whatever mystery awaited him next. Chapter 12. The Lingering Echoes. The departure from Harwood Hall was a quiet affair. The grandeur of the estate now tinged with a sombre air that seemed to cling to its ivy-clad walls. The sun, though bright, could not fully erase the shadows of the tragedy that had unfolded, and the guests, as they prepared to leave, moved with the hesitancy of those who had glimpsed the darker side of human nature. Captain Hastings, packing his small suitcase in the guest room, felt a peculiar mix of relief and unease. The case was solved. Gerald Langley's guilt laid bare by Hercule Poirot's unerring logic. Yet something about the resolution felt incomplete, as though a faint echo of the crime still reverberated through the house. Poirot, as always, was the picture of calm efficiency, his valise already packed, his moustache meticulously groomed. He stood by the window of the drawing room, gazing out at the gardens where the roses swayed in the breeze, their beauty a silent tribute to Lady Beatrice. Hastings joined him, his brow furrowed. "Poirot, it's over, isn't it? Langley's confessed, the police have him, and yet I can't shake the feeling that we've missed something.
Something small, perhaps, but significant. Poirot turned, his green eyes sharp with understanding.
Certain. But the ripples it has caused. The human heart, Hastings, it does not close the book so easily as the law. Let us speak with the others before we depart. There is one last thread to tug.
They found the remaining guests in the dining room, where a light luncheon had been laid out, though few seemed to have an appetite. Charles Harwood sat at the head of the table, his face drawn but resolute, as if determined to reclaim his role as master of the house. Eleanor Vance, beside him, offered a small smile, a hand resting lightly on his, a gesture of quiet strength. Sylvia Crane, pale and subdued, picked at her food, her eyes downcast, while Mrs. Clara Winthrop, ever the observer, watched the group with a glint of curiosity. Dr. Malcolm Reed, no longer under suspicion, seemed almost cheerful, his nervous tics replaced by a cautious optimism. Poirot cleared his throat, drawing their attention. Mesdames et messieurs, before Captain Hastings and I take our leave, I wish to offer a final word. The truth of Lady Beatrice's death has been revealed, and justice will follow its course. But I sense that there are questions, perhaps doubts, that linger in your hearts. If there is something you wish to share, now is the time. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the clink of a spoon against a saucer. Sylvia Crane looked up, her voice barely audible. Mr. Poirot, I feel so foolish for what I said about Charles. I was so sure I saw him, but now I know I was wrong. I want to know why I thought it was him. Was I imagining things? Poirot's expression softened. Mademoiselle Crane, you did not imagine. The mind, it plays tricks when the heart is involved. You saw a figure, and because of your feelings for Monsieur Charles, you gave it his face. But it was Monsieur Langley, using the dim light in your emotions to cast suspicion elsewhere. You are not foolish. You are human. Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, a weight visibly lifting from her shoulders. Charles reached across the table, his voice gentle. Sylvia, it's all right. I don't blame you. You were trying to help. Eleanor squeezed Charles' hand, her gaze steady. Mr. Poirot, you've given us closure, but I can't help wondering, was there anything we could have done to prevent this? If we'd seen Langley's desperation sooner, could we have saved her? Poirot's gaze was thoughtful. Mademoiselle Vance, the what-if is a question that haunts us all. Lady Beatrice's discovery of Langley's betrayal was her—
Madam Winthrop, your insight is keen, yet you did not share it until now. Why?
Clara shrugged, her smirk fading. What was there to say? Beatrice wasn't one for gossip, and I had no proof, just a feeling. Besides, who'd listen to an old widow's hunches? Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. Feelings, madame, are often the first whisper of truth, but in this case, the truth required evidence, and evidence we have found. Dr. Reed spoke up, his voice steadier than it had been in days. Mr. Poirot, I owe you my thanks. I thought I'd be locked up for something I didn't do. That cyanide in the conservatory, it was a nightmare. Poirot inclined his head. Monsieur le Docteur, the cyanide was a clever misdirection, but it could not withstand scrutiny. The guilty rely on chaos, but order always prevails. As the conversation wound down, Poirot and Hastings prepared to leave, their car waiting at the front of the hall. Charles escorted them to the door, his gratitude evident. Mr. Poirot, you've given us back our peace, or at least the chance to find it. Harwood Hall won't be the same without Mother. but we'll carry on, for her." Poirot's smile was warm. "Monsieur Harwood, carry her memory with pride. She was a woman of great heart, and her legacy endures in you." As they stepped into the car, Hastings glanced back at the towering silhouette of Harwood Hall, its windows gleaming in the sunlight. "Poirot," he said as the car pulled away, "you said there was one last thread. Did we find it? Or is there still something unresolved?" Poirot's eyes twinkled, but his voice was serious. "The thread, Hastings, was the human heart, the doubts, the guilt, the love. They are the echoes of this crime. We have answered the question of who killed Lady Beatrice, but the why, the betrayal, the greed, it leaves a mark. It is the nature of such cases, no? To solve the crime is not always to heal the wound." Hastings nodded, his thoughts drifting to the guests they were leaving behind. Charles and Eleanor, bound by love but tested by tragedy. Sylvia, her heart bruised, but perhaps stronger for it. Clara, whose sharp tongue hid a keen mind. Reed, freed from suspicion, but forever changed. And Harwood Hall itself, a place of beauty and secrets, now quieter, but not without its ghosts. As the car wound through the Sussex countryside, Poirot leaned back, his hands folded neatly. "The world, Hastings, it is full of such stories. Love and betrayal, trust and deceit. But for every shadow there is light, and we bring that light, do we not?" Hastings smiled, the weight in his chest easing. "We do, Poirot. We do." The car carried them toward London, leaving Harwood Hall behind, its secrets laid bare, but its echoes.
Sorry, Trings out. No would together selves to restore it. Chapter 13. The Unseen Motive. The journey back to London was a quiet one, the hum of the car's engine blending with the rustle of autumn leaves along the Sussex lanes. Captain Hastings, seated beside Hercule Poirot, stared out at the passing countryside, his mind still tethered to Harwood Hall. The case was solved. Gerald Langley's guilt confirmed. And yet a nagging sense of incompletion lingered, like a melody unresolved. Poirot, as ever, seemed unperturbed, his small hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes half closed as though savoring the rhythm of his own thoughts. "Hastings," Poirot said at last, his voice breaking the silence, "you are troubled, no? You feel the echo of Harwood Hall, the sense that not all has been revealed. Am I correct?" Hastings turned, startled by his friend's perceptiveness. "You read me like a book, Poirot. Langley's the murderer, no doubt about it. But there's something off. Why did Lady Beatrice confront him alone? Why not expose him to Charles or the authorities? And that letter? Debts must be settled, promises broken. It feels like there's more to it than just Langley's embezzlement." Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint smile playing beneath it. "Mon ami, your instincts are improving. There is a thread we have not fully unraveled. Not the crime itself, but the why behind it. Lady Beatrice's actions, they suggest a motive deeper than mere financial betrayal. Before we leave this case behind, I propose we make one final inquiry, a small detour, if you will." Hastings raised an eyebrow. "A detour? Where to, Poirot?" "To the village," Poirot replied, his tone decisive. "There is a solicitor's office there, where Monsieur Langley kept his records. I wish to see if Lady Beatrice left any other documents. Perhaps a will, perhaps a letter that might illuminate her final intentions." The car turned toward the village of Harwood, a quaint cluster of stone cottages and a single high street, where Langley's modest office stood between a bakery and a post office. The clerk, a nervous young man named Mr. Thompson, was startled by the arrival of the famous detective, but quickly complied
with Poirot's request. Producing a locked box labelled with Lady Beatrice's name. "Mr. Langley kept this for her," Thompson said, his voice trembling. "It's private, but since you're investigating her death." Poirot opened the box with a key provided by the clerk, revealing a small collection of documents. Among them was a sealed envelope, addressed in Lady Beatrice's elegant hand to "My Family." Poirot's eyes gleamed as he broke the seal, unfolding a letter dated just days before her death.
"Am gone, and the truth of my actions must be known. I have discovered a betrayal that cuts deeper than I can bear, not merely of money, but of trust. Gerald Langley, whom I trusted as a friend, has been siphoning funds from our estate, a slow theft that threatens our legacy. I confronted him, hoping to appeal to his honor, but I fear his desperation may lead to darker deeds. I have chosen to keep this from you, Charles, to spare you the pain of such treachery, but I also made arrangements. My will, held by Mr. Thompson, ensures that Harwood Hall remains yours, untainted by Langley's greed. There is one more promise I must break, a promise to another, made long ago, that I can no longer keep in good conscience. Forgive me, and know that I loved you all. Beatrice." Harwood Hastings' breath caught as he read the words. "She knew Langley might kill her," he said, his voice low. "She was protecting Charles, the estate. But what's this about another promise?" Poirot's gaze was distant, his fingers tracing the letter's edge. "Oui, Hastings, the unseen motive. Lady Beatrice was a woman of duty, but also of secrets. This promise, it is not about Langley. It is something older, deeper, tied to the heart of Harwood Hall." They returned to the car, the letter safely tucked in Poirot's valise, and made their way back to London. But Poirot's mind was clearly elsewhere, his little grey cells working to unravel this final thread. In London, they stopped at Poirot's flat, where he spread the letter and his notebook on the table, his eyes narrowing as he reviewed his notes. "The promise," he murmured. "It is connected to someone in the house. Not Langley, but another. We must consider the relationships, the past." Hastings, pouring himself a brandy, frowned. "You think there's another secret? But the murder's solved, Poirot. Langley's motive was clear. Greed, fear of exposure. What else could there be?" Poirot's smile was faint, but knowing. "The human heart, Hastings, it is a labyrinth. Lady Beatrice's letter speaks of a promise broken, one that caused her pain. I suspect it involves Mademoiselle Crane, or perhaps Madame Winthrop. Their connections to the Harwoods run deep, no?" Hastings sat up, his mind racing. "Sylvia? You think she's tied to this promise? She was in love with Charles, but Lady Beatrice would be staying."
The meeting, held in a private parlour, was tense but subdued. Charles, still grieving, read his mother's letter with a furrowed brow, while Eleanor's eyes filled with tears.
"I don't understand," Charles said, his voice hoarse. "What promise did she break? She never mentioned anything like this to me." Poirot's tone was gentle. "Monsieur Harwood, your mother was a woman of great discretion. I believe this promise was made long ago, perhaps to someone close to the family. Tell me, was there ever a connection between your mother and Mademoiselle Crane's family? Something beyond friendship?" Charles hesitated, then nodded slowly. Sylvia's mother, Margaret, was Mother's closest friend in their youth. There was a story, something about a pact they made to ensure their families would always support each other. I never knew the details, but Mother always treated Sylvia like a daughter. Poirot's eyes gleamed. A pact. And perhaps, when your mother saw your love for Mademoiselle Vance, she felt she was breaking that pact by not encouraging a match with Mademoiselle Crane. It weighed on her, this sense of disloyalty. Eleanor's voice was soft. So she felt guilty, even though she didn't oppose our engagement outright. Poor Sylvia. She must have felt it too. Poirot nodded. Oui, mademoiselle. The heart carries its own burdens. Your mother's letter was her attempt to set things right, to protect the estate and her son, even at the cost of her life. As they left the hotel, Hastings felt the final piece of the puzzle settle into place. So that's it, Poirot? The promise was about Sylvia's family, and Lady Beatrice's guilt drove her to confront Langley alone? Oui, Poirot said, his voice quiet. The unseen motive was not greed, but duty. A mother's duty to her son, a friend's duty to a promise. It cost her dearly, but it has saved Harwood Hall. As they walked into the London dusk, the city's lights flickering to life, Hastings felt the echoes of Harwood Hall begin to fade. The case was truly closed, its secrets laid bare, and Poirot's little grey cells had once again brought order to chaos. Chapter 14. The Ties That Bind. The London air was crisp as Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings stepped out of the hotel. The city's hum, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of Harwood Hall. The meeting with Charles and Eleanor had brought clarity to Lady Beatrice's cryptic letter. Yet Hastings could not shake the sense that the case, those— "You are still troubled, Non? The puzzle is complete, the murderer apprehended, the motive uncovered, yet you feel the weight of something unresolved. Tell me, what is it?" Hastings sighed, his breath visible in the chilly evening air. "It's Sylvia, Poirot. She's been through so much, her love for Charles, her mistaken accusation, and now this revelation about her mother's pact with Lady Beatrice. It feels like she's been caught in a storm she didn't create. Will she be all right?" Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint smile softening his features. "Mon ami, your heart is as generous as ever. Mademoiselle Crane is a soul bruised but not broken. The truth, it is painful, but it also sets free. She will find her way, as will Monsieur Charles and Mademoiselle Vance. But you are right. There is one last act to play, to ensure the ties that bind this family do not fray further." Poirot's words hinted at a plan, and Hastings, accustomed to his friend's penchant for tying up loose ends, followed as they hailed a cab back to Poirot's flat. There, over a cup of hot chocolate, Poirot's preferred remedy for the evening chill, the detective penned a letter to Sylvia Crane, requesting her presence the following morning. "We must speak with her, Hastings," Poirot explained, his pen moving with its usual precision. "Not to accuse, but to heal. The pact between her mother and Lady Beatrice, it is a wound that needs tending." The next morning, Sylvia arrived at Poirot's flat, a delicate frame wrapped in a simple wool coat, her eyes still shadowed, but steadier than they had been at Harwood Hall. She sat across from Poirot, her hands clasped tightly,
as though bracing for another blow. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice soft but clear, "your telegram said you had something important to discuss. Is there more about Lady Beatrice's death?" Poirot's expression was gentle, almost fatherly. "Mademoiselle Crane, the matter of Lady Beatrice's death is resolved. Monsieur Langley's guilt is certain, and justice will follow. But I have asked you here because of the letter we found, the one that spoke of a promise broken. It concerns you, and I believe you deserve to understand its full meaning." Sylvia's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "The promise. Charles mentioned something about a pact between our mothers. I don't know much about it, only that they were close like sisters when they were young." Poirot nodded, producing a copy of Lady Beatrice's letter from his desk. "This letter, mademoiselle, reveals that your mother, Margaret, and Lady Beatrice made a pact long ago, a vow to support each other's families, to ensure their futures were intertwined. Lady Beatrice felt she had broken this promise by not encouraging a match between you and her son
Alone, hoping to protect the Harwood legacy without burdening you or Charles." Sylvia's hands trembled, and she pressed them to her lips.
"She felt guilty because of me? Oh, Mr. Poirot, I never wanted that. I loved Charles, yes, but I knew he loved Eleanor. I would never have asked Lady Beatrice to interfere."
Poirot's voice was soothing. "I know, mademoiselle. And Lady Beatrice knew it too. Her guilt was not your fault. It was the burden of her own sense of duty. She wished to honor her friend's memory, but she also wished her son to follow his heart. This conflict, it drove her to act in secret, and it cost her life. But you must not carry that weight." Tears welled in Sylvia's eyes, but she nodded, her voice steadying.
When I saw that figure in the corridor, I thought it was Charles, and I was so afraid he'd done something terrible. I feel so foolish now."
Poirot leaned forward, his gaze warm. "Mademoiselle, you were not foolish. You were brave to speak, even when it pained you. Your heart led you astray, but it also led us to the truth. You have nothing to reproach yourself for." Hastings, watching from the corner, felt a pang of admiration for Poirot's ability to offer comfort without losing his clarity. "Miss Crane," he ventured, "you'll be all right, won't you? You're stronger than you think." Sylvia managed a small smile, her first in days.
"Thank you, Captain Hastings. And you, Mr. Poirot. I think I can start to let go now. I'll always love Charles, but I want him and Eleanor to be happy, and I'll honor my mother's memory by living well."
Poirot inclined his head, his expression one of quiet approval. "That, mademoiselle, is the greatest tribute you can pay. Go forward with courage, and know that Harwood Hall's shadows no longer hold you." After Sylvia left, her step lighter than when she arrived, Hastings turned to Poirot. "You did more than solve a crime, Poirot. You gave her peace. That's no small thing." Poirot's smile was modest. "The solving of a crime, Hastings, it is not merely about catching the guilty. It is about restoring order to the law, yes, but also to the heart. Mademoiselle Crane needed to understand her place in this story, and now she can move forward." They spent the rest of the day tying up loose ends. Poirot sent a final report to Inspector Grayson, detailing the evidence against Langley, the cigarette case, the scratch on the workbench, the burned letter, all meticulously documented. He also wrote to Charles, enclosing a copy of his mother's letter, urging him to cherish Eleanor and to honor the Harwood legacy with integrity. As evening fell, Poirot and Hastings sat by the fire in the flat, the city's lights twinkling beyond the window. "You know, Poirot," Hastings said,
"Think about what really matters." Poirot nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Oui, Hastings, the ties that bind us, they are fragile, yet strong. Lady Beatrice understood this, and in her way,
She protected those ties, even at the cost of her life. It is a lesson we would do well to remember. The fire crackled, its warmth a counterpoint to the chill of the case's memory. Harwood Hall was behind them, its secrets laid bare. But the echoes of its story, of love, betrayal, and redemption, would linger, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the delicate balance of the human heart. Chapter 15. The Final Curtain. The London evening settled over Poirot's flat like a soft curtain, the city's hum muted by the thick walls and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Captain Hastings, seated in his usual armchair, felt the weight of the Harwood Hall case begin to lift, though its echoes still lingered in his mind. The revelation of Gerald Langley's guilt, the unravelling of Lady Beatrice's cryptic letter, and the delicate mending of Sylvia Crane's wounded heart had brought the mystery to a close. Yet there was a final act to play, a moment of reflection that Poirot, with his unerring sense of closure, always insisted upon. The little Belgian detective sat opposite, his hands folded neatly, his eyes fixed on the flames, as though they held the answers to questions yet unasked. "Hastings," Poirot said at last, his voice soft but resonant, "you have been my companion through many a puzzle, and this one, it has been particularly intricate, no? A tapestry of greed, loyalty, and broken promises, woven with the threads of human emotion. But now, as we close the book on Harwood Hall, there is one final reflection to share." Hastings leaned forward, his brandy glass forgotten in his hand. "You mean there's more, Poirot? I thought we'd tied up every loose end. Langley's in custody, Sylvia's at peace, Charles and Eleanor are moving forward. What's left?" Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint smile playing beneath it. "What is left, mon ami, is the lesson, the philosophy, if you will, that each case imparts. The murder of Lady Beatrice was not merely a crime. It was a mirror held up to the souls of those involved, and we, who seek the truth, must look into that mirror and see what it reveals about ourselves." Hastings frowned, his brow furrowing. "You're getting philosophical again, Poirot, but I suppose you're right. This case was about more than just catching a killer. It was about trust, betrayal, and the choices people make when they're pushed to the edge." "Précisément," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "Lady Beatrice chose to confront Langley alone, to protect her son and her family's legacy. It was a choice born of duty but also of pride, a belief that she could control the outcome. Langley chose greed, and in his desperation he chose murder. Mademoiselle Crane chose to speak her truth, even at the risk of her heart. And we, Hastings, we chose to pursue the truth no matter how painful. These choices, they define us." The firelight cast long shadows across the room, and Hastings felt a pang of introspection. "You make it sound so simple, Poirot, but it's not. Sylvia could have stayed silent. Charles could have turned against Eleanor. Langley could have confessed earlier. It's all so fragile." Poirot nodded, his expression softening. "Oui, fragile, yet resilient. The human heart, it bends, but does not always break. And that, Hastings, is why we do what we do, to restore order where chaos threatens to destroy. To give those like Mademoiselle Crane, Monsieur Charles, and Mademoiselle Vance a chance to heal." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a letter, delivered by the evening post. It was from Charles Harwood, written in a steady hand, and addressed to both Poirot and Hastings. Poirot opened it with care, his eyes scanning the lines before he read aloud. "Dear Mr. Poirot and Captain Hastings, Eleanor and I are settling in London, preparing for a quieter life as we plan our future. The shadow of Mother's death will always be with us, but your work has given us the clarity to move forward. We have decided to honor Mother's memory by restoring Harwood Hall, not just as a home, but as a place of community, a library, perhaps, or a school where her love of knowledge can live on. Sylvia has agreed to help, and I believe it will give her purpose. Your kindness to her, Mr. Poirot, has not gone unnoticed. We are forever in your debt. Yours sincerely, Charles Harwood." Hastings smiled, a warmth spreading through him.
That's good news, Poirot. They're rebuilding, just as you said they would. Poirot folded the letter carefully, placing it in his desk. Oui, Hastings, they are weaving new threads into the tapestry of Harwood Hall, and Mademoiselle Crane, she will find her strength in this purpose. It is as it should be. The evening passed in quiet companionship, Poirot and Hastings sharing a simple meal as they reflected on the case. Poirot, ever the philosopher, spoke of the balance between justice and mercy, of the need to see not just the crime, but the humanity behind it. The detective, he said, is not merely a hunter of criminals. He is a guardian of truth, a restorer of order, and that, mon ami, is a task that never ends. Hastings nodded, his thoughts drifting to the faces of Harwood Hall, Charles's grief, Eleanor's quiet strength, Sylvia's fragile courage, Clara's sharp wit, Reed's nervous relief. Each had played a part in the drama, and each had been touched by Poirot's relentless pursuit of the truth. You know, Poirot, he said, his voice soft, sometimes I think you see more than the clues. You see the people, the reasons they do what they do. It's what makes you, well, you.
Hastings. But it is you, with your heart so open, who reminds me why I do this work. Together, we are a fine pair, no? As the fire died down, casting the room into a gentle glow, Poirot rose, his movements precise as ever. Come, mon ami, the night grows late, and London awaits us. There will be other mysteries, other tapestries to unravel, but for now, we rest, knowing we have brought light to one small corner of the world. Hastings followed, his heart lighter than it had been in days. Harwood Hall was behind them, its secrets laid bare, its wounds beginning to heal. The case had been a storm, but Poirot, with his little grey cells and his unwavering sense of justice, had guided them through. As they stepped into the London night, the stars above seemed a little brighter, a silent promise that order, however fragile, would always prevail.